Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Storm of Steel, Chapter 10, in the village of Fresnoy. My leave, on which I went a few days later, was this time not curtailed. I find in my diary this brief but eloquent record. Leave spent very happily, need have no reproaches on that score after my death. On the 9th April 1917 I returned to the 2nd Company, then quartered in the village of Mérigny, not far from Douai. The pleasure of my return was dashed by an unexpected alarm which had for me the peculiarly unpleasant consequence that I had to ride the company charger to Beaumont. Through rain and sleet I rode at the head of the transport that slipped all over the paved road till we reached our destination at 1 a.m. When I had seen to my horse and the men as well as I could, I went in search of quarters for myself, but there was not an unoccupied corner to be found. At last a commissariat orderly had the excellent idea of offering me his bed, as he had to sit up for the telephone calls. While I was pulling off my boots and spurs, he told me that the English had captured Vimy Ridge and a lot of ground from the Bavarians. I could not help observing, in spite of his hospitality, that he was not at all pleased to find his quiet village headquarters turned into an assembly point for the fighting troops. The next morning the battalion marched in the direction of heavy firing to the village of Fresnoy. There I received orders to set up an observation post. I took a few men and explored the western outskirts of the village and found a cottage in whose roof I had a lookout post made that commanded the front. We took the cellar as our dwelling place, and in the course of making room there we came upon a sack of potatoes, a very welcome addition to our scanty provisions. My batman now roasted me potatoes every evening with salt. Lieutenant Gornick also, like a true friend, sent me a large parcel of Leberwurst and some red wine. He had found them among the stores left behind in haste in Villerval, which had already been evacuated, but which Gornick was holding as an outpost with one platoon. I at once equipped an expedition furnished with perambulators and similar means of transport to secure this treasure. Unfortunately, it returned empty-handed, as the English were already in full strength on the edge of the village. Gornick told me later that after the discovery of a large cellar of red wine, a drinking bout had started which, in spite of the attack then being made on the village, it had been extremely difficult to bring to a close. On the 14th of April I was given the task of organizing an intelligence clearing station in the village. For this purpose I had dispatch riders, bicyclists, telephone and light signal stations, underground telegraph wires, carrier pigeons, and a chain of very light posts placed at my disposal. I looked out a suitable cellar with a deep dugout and returned for the last time to my dwelling place on the western edge of the village. During the night I fancied I heard a crash now and then and shouts from my batman, but I was so dazed with sleep that I only murmured, let them shoot, and turned over, though the whole place was thick with dust. The next morning I was awakened by little Schulz, Colonel von Oppen's nephew, who was shouting, "I say, don't you know yet that your whole house has been blown to blazes?" When I got up and surveyed the damage, I observed that a shell of the heaviest caliber had been planted on the roof, and that the observation post, indeed the whole house, was no more. If the velocity had only been a trifle slower, the hit would have got us in the cellar and plastered the walls with us, so that in the nice saying of the trenches, we might have been scraped off with a spoon and buried in the pot. Schulz told me that his orderly said to him when he saw the ruins of the house, "There was a lieutenant in there yesterday. Better have a look and see whether he's still there." My batman was beside himself at the way I had slept through it. During the morning we shifted our quarters into the new cellar. On the way we were nearly hit by the church tower, which the engineers were unobtrusively blowing up in order to deprive the enemy of an easy mark. In a neighboring village they had forgotten to warn a post of 2 men who were keeping a lookout from the top of the tower there. By a miracle they were retrieved uninjured from the debris. We furnished our roomy cellar very passably, for we collected what we required from mansion or cottage, and what we had no use for we burned in the stove. During the first day, there was a succession of duels to the death in the air. They ended nearly every time in the defeat of the English, as Richthofen's battle formation was circling over the neighborhood. Often, 5 or 6 machines were driven down or shot down in flames. Once we saw the pilot thrown from his machine and fall to the earth as a separate black speck. There were dangers, too, in staring up into the sky. A man of the 4th Company was killed by a falling splinter that hit him in the neck. On the 18th April, I paid a visit to the 2nd Company in the line. It held a salient in front of the village of Arleux. Lieutenant Boye told me that he had only a single casualty for a long while, as the English shelling was so methodical that it allowed them to sidestep and avoid it every time. After I had wished him all the best, I had to leave the village at the gallop on account of the continuous shooting by the enemy's heavy guns. I stopped 300 meters behind Arleux to watch the clouds that rose from each hit. They were red or black, according to whether brick walls had been pounded or garden soil flung up, and among them was the delicate white of exploding shrapnel. When a few whiz-bangs began falling on the footpaths that connected Arleux with Fresnoy, I abandoned the pursuit of further impressions and decamped at full speed in case I might be slain, as the stock phrase then was in the 2nd Company. I was often making expeditions of this kind, sometimes as far as the little town of Ornines-Lietard, for during the first 14 days, in spite of my large staff, there was not a single report to communicate. From the 20th April, Fresnoy was shelled by a 30.5 centimeter gun. The shells came over with a perfect infernal hiss. After each hit, the village was veiled in a huge reddish-brown cloud of picric acid gas. Even the Duds caused a small earthquake. A man of the 9th Company, who was surprised by one of them in the courtyard of the chateau, was flung over the trees in the park and broke most of his bones in the fall. In the afternoon, the village was shelled with all calibers. In spite of the danger, I could not tear myself from the attic windows of my house. It was a breathless sight to see how small parties and dispatch carriers chased over the shelled area, often throwing themselves flat, while the ground was flung up on every side of them. When I went into the village after this, one more cellar had been hit and set on fire. The salvage operations recovered only 3 bodies. Near the cellar lay one on its face, with the uniform in shreds. The head was torn off, and the blood flowed into a puddle of water. When the stretcher-bearer turned the body over to remove any valuables, I could not help seeing that on the stump of the arm there was only a thumb. The enemy artillery became more active every day and left no doubt of an early attack. On the 27th April at midnight, I had the following telephone message. 6-7 from 5 a.m., which meant in code, utmost readiness for an alarm at 5 a.m. And so I lay down again, hoping to be all the better prepared for the expected exertions. However, as I was just falling asleep, a shell hit the house and blew in the wall of the cellar stairs and through the masonry into the cellar. We jumped up and hurried into the dugout. As we crouched on the steps in the light of a candle, disconcerted and wary, the sergeant of the night light signaling section, whose post, together with 2 valuable signaling lamps, had been smashed up in the afternoon, came rushing in. "Sir, the cellar of number 11 has had a direct hit, and some of the men are still buried in the ruins." As I had 2 cyclists and 3 telephonists in number 11, I took some men and hurried for their help. I found a lance corporal and a wounded man in the dugout and was given the following account. When the shells began to fall suspiciously near, 4 of the 5 occupants of the cellar decided to go down into the dugout shaft. One of them went straight away, one stayed where he was in bed, while the remaining 3 delayed to pull on their boots. The most prudent and the last, as so often in war, came off the best. The first had not a scratch, and the second had a splinter in the thigh. The 3 others were caught by the shell, which came through the cellar wall and exploded in the opposite corner. After this narration, I lit a cigar and went into the smoke-filled cellar. In the middle of it, there was a heap of wreckage, bedsteads, straw mattresses, and various pieces of furniture all in fragments and piled nearly up to the roof. After we had put a few candles on ledges of the walls, we set to work. Catching hold of the limbs that stuck out from the wreckage, we pulled out the dead bodies. One had the head struck off, and the neck on the trunk was like a great sponge of blood. From the arm stumps of another, the broken bones projected, and the uniform was saturated by a large wound in the chest. The entrails of the third poured out from a wound in the belly. As we pulled out the last, a splintered board caught in the ghastly wound with a hideous noise. The orderly made a comment on this and was reproved by my batman with these words: "Best hold your tongue. In such matters, talking nonsense serves no purpose." I took an inventory of the valuables found on them. It was a horrible job. The candles flickered red in the vaporous air, and as the two men handed me pocketbooks and silver objects, it seemed as though we were engaged in some dark and secret work. The fine yellow plaster dust fell on the faces of the dead and gave them the fixed look of waxed figures. We threw coverings over them and hurried out of the cellar after taking up the wounded man in a ground sheet. With the stoical advice to set his teeth, we carried him through a whirl of shrapnel fire to the dressing station dugout. When I got back to my dwelling place, the first thing I did was to have a few cherry brandies. The experience I had been through had touched my nerve. Soon we were being violently shelled once more, and with the example before our eyes of what artillery fire can do in cellars, we made all speed into the dugout shaft. At 5:15 a.m., the fire increased to an incredible violence. Our dugout rocked and trembled like a ship on a stormy sea. All round resounded the rending of masonry and the crash of collapsing houses. At 7 a.m., I received a message by light signal addressed to the 2nd Battalion. "Brigade requires immediate report on the situation." After an hour, a dispatch carrier brought back the news. "Enemy taken Arleux and Arleux Park. Ordered 8th Company to counterattack. No news so far. Rochol, Captain." This was the only message that my tremendous apparatus of transmission had to deal with during all 3 weeks of my time in Fresnoy. Though certainly it was a very important one. And now that my activity was of the utmost value, the artillery fire had put nearly the whole organization out of action. Such were the results of over-centralization. This surprising information explained why we had heard rifle bullets fired at not very great range clattering against the walls of the houses. We had scarcely realized the great losses suffered by the regiment when the shelling was renewed with increasing fury. My batman was standing, the last of all, on the top step of the dugout stairs when a crash like thunder announced that the English had at last succeeded in knocking in our cellar. The trusty Knigge got a squared building stone on the back but was not hurt. Above, everything was shot to blazes. Daylight came to us past 2 bicycles squeezed into the dugout entrance. We made ourselves as small as we could on the lowest step, while heavy explosions and the din of falling masonry convinced us of the insecurity of our refuge. By a miracle, the telephone was still working, so I explained the plight we were in to my chief at the division and received orders to withdraw my men into the dressing station dugout close by. After packing up what it was most essential to take with us, we set about leaving the dugout by the second and only remaining exit. In spite of my peremptory order, backed up by unequivocal threats, the telephone staff, which was not much used to war, hesitated so long to venture out of the protection of the dugout into the shell fire that this exit, too, was smashed in with a crash by a heavy shell. Luckily, no one was hit, only our little dog howled miserably and from that moment was never seen again. We pushed aside the bicycles that barred the way out through the cellar and, creeping on all fours over the heaps of debris, got into the open through a narrow crack in the wall. We did not pause to observe the incredible change that these few hours had produced in the village, but ran out of it as fast as we could. The last of us had scarcely left the yard gates when the house got another tremendous hit. A compact belt of fire covered the area between the edge of the village and the dressing station dugout. Light and heavy shells with direct and delay action fuses, darts, empty cases and shrapnel combined to produce a nightmare of acoustic and optical effects. Through it, passing to right and left on the witch's cauldron seething in the village, the reserves were marching up. In Fresnoy, the shells were sanding the earth in fountains as high as church towers. Each seemed bent on outdoing its predecessor. As though by magic, one house after another was sucked into the earth. Walls collapsed, gables fell, and bare rafters were flung through the air to mow the roofs of neighboring houses. Clouds of splinters danced above the whitish swaths of vapor. Eye and ear hung as though entranced upon this dance of destruction. We spent 2 days in a painfully confined space in the dressing station dugout, for besides my men, there were the staffs of 2 battalions, 2 relief detachments, and the indispensable corps troops. Naturally, the constant coming and going in front of the entrances was observed by the enemy. Soon the range was got to a yard, and at intervals of a minute shells fell on the track outside. And there were casualties all the time. Indeed, the shouts for stretcher bearers never ceased. I lost 4 bicycles which we had left outside, owing to this disagreeable bombardment. They were scattered to the 4 winds in various states of contortion. Stark and still, and wrapped in a ground sheet, Lieutenant Lemierre, the commander of the 8th Company, lay at the entrance, his large horn spectacles still on his nose. His men had brought him there. He was shot in the mouth. His younger brother was killed a few months later in exactly the same way. On the 30th April, I handed over to my successor of the 25th Regiment, by whom we were relieved. We made our way to Flers, the rendezvous of the 1st Battalion. Leaving the much-shelled lime kilns, Chebonton, on our left, we went quickly on through the afternoon sunshine along the path to Beaumont. Our eyes rejoiced again in the beauty of the earth. We drew in the intoxicating breath of spring, thankful to have escaped the intolerably crowded confinement of the dugout. With the thunder of guns in our rear, my sympathies were with the poet. Surely the day that God has given has better uses than to kill. In Flers, I found the quarter allotted me in the possession of some staff sergeant majors who, under the pretext that they had to keep the room for a certain Baron von X, refused to give it up to me. They failed, however, to reckon with the overstrained nerves of a worn-out frontline soldier. I told my men to smash in the door, and after a brief hand-to-hand engagement under the eyes of the owner of the house, who, much alarmed, hastened on to the scene in his dressing gown, we sent the gentleman flying down the stairs. My batman carried politeness to such lengths that he threw their trench boots after them. After this assault, I took possession of the warm bed, surrendering half of it to my friend Kius, who was wandering round without a billet. Sleeping in a bed after so long a time did us so much good that we woke the next morning in all our pristine vigor. As the 1st Battalion had come off the lightest in casualties of the recent days of fighting, we were in excellent trim as we marched to Douai station. From there, we went by train to the junction of Busigny. We were to have some days' rest in Serran, a village in the neighborhood. The population was friendly, and we had good quarters. On the very first evening, the sounds of happy foregatherings were to be heard from many of the houses. These drink offerings on the morrow of well-fought fights count among an old soldier's happiest memories. And though 10 out of 12 had fallen, still the last 2, as sure as death, were to be found on the first evening of rest over the bottle, drinking a silent health to their dead companions, talking and laughing over all they had been through. For dangers past, an old soldier's laugh. For those to come, a full glass. Though death and the devil grin there as long as the wine was good, such has ever been the custom of war. It was the officers' mess more than all that made me appreciate this. It was here, among the spirits of the undaunted dead, that the will to conquer was concentrated and made visible in the features of each weather-beaten face. There was an element at work here that the very horror of the war underlined and even spiritualized, an element one seldom found among the men with whom one lay in the shell holes, sporting joy in danger and a chivalrous impulse to see things out. And to say the least of it, I have never, in this much reviled circle, heard one faint-hearted word. My batman came next morning and read me the orders. From these, it appeared that I was to take command of the 3rd Company. It was in this company, in the autumn of 1914, that Hermann Löns, the Lower Saxon poet, fell. Chapter 11. Against Indians. On the 6th May 1917, we were once more on the march to the now familiar Broncourt, and on the following day we went through Montbrehan, Ramicourt and Joncourt into the Siegfried Line, which we had left just a month before. The first evening was stormy. Heavy rain pattered down without ceasing onto the flooded ground. Soon, however, a succession of bright, warm days reconciled us to our new station. I enjoyed the wonderful country undisturbed by the white puffs of shrapnel and the leaping cones of the shell bursts. Indeed, I scarcely noticed them. In those years of increased activity, the signs of an offensive were as much a part of the spring as primroses and opening buds. Our lines formed a crescent in front of the Sorcontine Canal. Behind us was the famous Siegfried Line. I never could tell why we had to occupy the narrow, unfinished trenches in the chalk when behind us lay this magnificent line. The front line wound through an idyllic meadowland, shadowed by small groups of trees and beautified now by tender colors of spring. We could move about with impunity behind and in front of the trench, for our front was protected by a belt of outposts pushed forward to a depth of 1 kilometer. These posts were a thorn in the enemy's side, and not a night went by for many weeks that he did not try to dislodge them either by cunning or by force. Our first spell in the line was, however, passed in welcome quiet. The weather was so fine that the men slept out on the grass. On the 14th May, we were relieved by the 8th Company and, leaving the burning Sorcontine on the right, proceeded to our rest place, Montbrehan, a large village that so far had suffered very little from the war and therefore had very comfortable quarters to offer. On the 20th, as company in reserve, we occupied the Siegfried Line. The weather was gorgeous, and day after day we sat in the numerous arbors built in the side of the trench, or bathed in the canal, or boated on it. The objection to occupying a trench otherwise so ideal lies in the frequent visits from superior officers, a pleasure very little esteemed in the line. In any case, my left wing had no cause to complain of being too safe. It extended nearly to the village of Bollonglis, already seriously nibbled at, and on the very first day one of my men got a shrapnel bullet wound in the right buttock. When I hastened to the scene of the disaster, he was seated in great content on his left side, awaiting stretcher-bearers and filling in the time with an enormous slice of bread and jam. On the 25th May, we relieved the 12th Company in Rigwell Farm. This farm, formerly a large estate, was occupied in turns by each of the 4 companies in the line. There were 3 machine gun positions at different points in our rear, and these had to be manned by sections in rotation. These strong points, distributed behind the line and covering each other like squares on a chessboard, were the first experiment in an elastic scheme of defense. The rest of the men were sent forward on working parties every night. The farm lay 1,500 meters at most behind the front line. Nevertheless, the buildings, surrounded by a well-timbered park, were still entirely intact. As there were deep dugouts under construction, there were plenty of men there. The red may-tree avenues in the park and the charm of the surroundings gave our life there something of the cheerful enjoyment which the Frenchman means by his vie de champagne, in spite of the nearness to the front. A pair of swallows had nested in my bedroom. Before it was light, they started on the noisy business of feeding their brood. In the evenings I took my stick from the corner and wandered along the narrow paths that went up and down through the hilly country. The neglected fields were scented with wildflowers. Here and there, single trees stood by the wayside. In peacetime, the laborers must often rested beneath them. They had an air of enchantment, standing alone in solitude, covered with blossom white or pink or red. It seemed that the war had thrown a heroic and melancholy light over the landscape, and without disturbing its loveliness, added a ray to its brightness and a strength to its spell. It is easier to go into the battle in the midst of such beauties of nature than when surrounded by a dead and cold winter landscape. Somehow it comes to one quite simply that one's existence is part of an eternal circuit, and that the death of a single individual is no great matter. On the 30th May, this idyll came to an end as far as I was concerned, for the command of 4th Company was taken over again by Lieutenant Vogelei, who had come out of the hospital. I rejoined my old 2nd Company, now under the command of a cavalry lieutenant, in the line. Our front, extending from the Roman road to the so-called artillery trench, was held by 2 platoons. The 3rd, with company headquarters, was about 200 meters to the rear, behind a small hill. There was a little wooden hut there, too, that I used to occupy with Lieutenant Kius, peacefully relying upon the poor shooting of the English artillery. One side of it was built into the slope of a little hill facing the enemy. The 3 others trustingly offered themselves as a mark. Every day when the morning's greetings came hurtling across, the following dialogue might be heard between the occupants of the upper and lower bunks. "Is that you, Ernst? They're shooting, aren't they? Well, let's lie where we are a little longer. I think those were the last ones." After a quarter of an hour, "Is that you, Oscar?" "Yes." "They're not going to stop today. I think that was a shrapnel bullet that came through the wall just now. We better get up. That artillery observer fellow cleared out long ago." We had always optimistically taken off our boots. By the time we were ready, the shooting had generally let off, and we could seat ourselves happily at the absurdly small table and drink coffee that the heat had turned sour and light our morning cigars. In the afternoon, in scorn of the English artillery, we used to have sun baths on the ground sheet in front of the door. Our cabin was extremely entertaining in other respects too. When one lay in sweet idleness on the wire mattress, gigantic earthworms hung pendulum-wise from the earth wall and shot into their holes with inconceivable rapidity at the least touch. A peevish mole sniffed about from his tunnel and added much to the enlivenment of our prolonged siesta. On the 12th June, I had to occupy the outpost on the company front with 20 men. It was late when we left the trench and went into warm evening air by the footpath winding over the undulating ground. Dusk was so far advanced that the red poppies in the untilled fields blended with the vivid green grass to an extraordinarily rich tone. We strolled silently along over the carpet of flowers. Each man was busy with his own thoughts, our rifles hung from our shoulders, and in 20 minutes we arrived at our destination. In whispers the post was taken over. Silently guards were mounted. Then the men we relieved disappeared into the darkness. The outpost rested upon a short steep hill. In the rear a wild and tangled wood melted into the night. It was separated from our steep bank by about 100 meters of meadow ground. In front and to our right rose 2 hills over which ran the English lines. There was a ruin on one with the promising name Ascension Farm. A sunken road ran between these hills to the enemy. And now, just as my posts had gone out, appeared Sergeant Major Hackmann with a few men of the 7th Company just about to go on patrol. I attached myself to them as camp follower, though I had no business to leave my post. Using a method of advance invented by myself, we crossed 2 entanglements that barred our way and got over the crest of the hill without, to our surprise, having run into a single outpost. We could now hear English working parties to right and to the left of us. It was clear to me after this event that the enemy had withdrawn his own posts so as not to involve them in fire, which, as I shall shortly explain, he was about to open on ours. My method of advance, mentioned just now, consisted in this, that over ground in which we might at any moment run up against the enemy, each member of the patrol crept forward in turn. In this way, only one man at a time exposed himself to the risk of being shot from an ambush, while the rest, in a body behind, lay in readiness to attack. Naturally, I took care to take my turn as leader, although my mere presence with the patrol was bad enough in itself. An officer in the front line often has to put himself technically in the wrong from considerations of a personal kind. We stalked several working parties that unfortunately were separated from us by dense entanglements. The somewhat eccentric Sergeant Major suggested giving himself up as a deserter and holding the enemy in parley until we had surrounded the first post. This plan was turned down after a brief discussion, and we crept back, disappointed, to the outpost. There I sat down on the edge of the steep bank on my cloak and, lighting a pipe as cautiously as possible, I gave rein to my thoughts. In the midst of the most beautiful castle in the air, I was suddenly alarmed by a peculiar rustling in the wood and in the meadow. In the face of the enemy, the senses are always on the lookout, and it is remarkable that at such moments quite ordinary sounds can give one the instant conviction, something's up. At the same instant the nearest post came up to me. "Sir, there are 70 Englishmen advancing to the edge of the wood." I was rather surprised by the numerical precision, but for the sake of prudence I hid myself, with the 4 men nearest me, on the edge of the bank in the long grass in order to observe how matters developed. After a few seconds I saw a body of men gliding over the meadow. While the men covered them with their rifles, I called out softly, "Who goes there?" It was Tylen Gerdes, an NCO, an old veteran of the 2nd Company, who was trying to collect his agitated section. I at once got them all in hand and formed them in line, with one flank on the wood and the other on the bank. In a moment, bayonets were fixed. When I was giving them directions and told a man who hung back to dress up with the rest, "I am a stretcher bearer," was the answer. The fellow had his drill well in his head. Comforted by this triumph of Prussian discipline, I gave the word to advance. While we were crossing the strip of meadow, a hail of shrapnel and a wild clatter of machine gun fire began from the English side. We broke, against our wills, into a double so as to reach the cover of the shoulder of the hill that lay to our front. Suddenly, a dark shadow rose in front of me. I seized the bomb and threw it. To my horror, I saw in the flash of the explosions that it was the NCO Tylen Gerdes who had got in front unobserved and had just been tripped up by a wire. Fortunately, he wasn't hurt. At the same time, we heard the sharper explosion of English bombs not far off, and the shrapnel fire increased to an unpleasant intensity. My firing line broke and disappeared in the direction of the steep bank, which was under heavy fire. I, with Tylen Gerdes and 3 more of the right sort, stood my ground. Suddenly, one of them rushed up to me and said, "The English!" Like a vision engraved for 1 second on my eyes, I saw a double row of kneeling figures, at that moment getting up and advancing over the meadow, which was lit up only by an occasional flash. I could clearly distinguish the figure of an officer on the right flank. Friend and foe were as though paralyzed by this abrupt and unexpected encounter. Then we did the one thing left to us to do, turned and made off before the enemy recovered sufficiently to fire a shot. We jumped up and ran back to the bank. Though I tripped and fell over a treacherous wire stretched through the tall grass, I got back without further misadventure. The men were there, but they were in a state of great agitation, and it cost me all my energy to get them into line, even elbow to elbow. I have always observed that the ordinary man whose sole preoccupation is his own danger is surprised by what seems to him an undivided attention to the matter in hand on the part of the officer in command, who, among 1,001 unnerving incidents of battle, yet keeps his eye fixed upon the execution of his duty. This surprise makes an officer excel himself and spurs him on to always greater achievements. In this way, officers and men call out energies in each other which would otherwise lie dormant. Indeed, the moral factor is everything. The enemy fire ceased of a sudden, and at the same time crackling and rustling sounds were heard in the undergrowth of the wood. "Halt! Who goes there? Password!" We kept on calling out for a good 5 minutes, and even shouted the old battle cry of the 1st Battalion, Lutjelage, an expression signifying schnapps and beer known to every Hanoverian. Only a strange and incomprehensible shout came in reply. At last, I took the responsibility on myself and gave the order to fire, though some of the men asserted that they had heard German words. The fire of 20 rifles swept the wood, bolts rattled, and soon the cry we heard changed to moans. This gave me a passing twinge of uncertainty. However, there were yellow flashes here and there in our direction, though they soon died away. One of the men was hit in the shoulder, and the stretcher-bearers bound him up. "Cease fire!" Slowly the command took effect, and the firing ceased. The men had quite recovered their nerve. Once more there were calls for the password, and on my side the persuasive summons, "Come here, you're prisoners, hands up!" Thereupon there were confused cries from the other side, which were interpreted by the men as "Rache, Rache," which translates to "Revenge, revenge." A single figure detached itself from the border of the wood and came towards us. One of the men was idiot enough to shout password at him, at which he stopped and turned around. "Shoot him!" There were a dozen shots, and he sank into a heap beneath the tall grass. This little episode gave us the feeling of satisfaction. Once more confused cries rang out from the edge of the wood. It seemed that the attacking party was encouraging each other to advance on their mysterious enemy. In the utmost excitement, we kept our eyes fixed on the dark strip of ground. It was beginning to dawn, and a light mist rose from the meadowland. Then a row of shadows rose out of the darkness. 5, 10, 15, a whole lot of them. Trembling fingers released the safety catches. They were 50 meters from us. 30, 15, fire! For a minute the rattles rattled out. Sparks showered up whenever the storm of bullets encountered weapons or steel helmets. Suddenly there was a shout, "Look out on the left!" Coming quickly on, a party of enemy was attacking us on the left flank. At the head of it was a giant with an outstretched revolver, swinging a white bludgeon. "Left section! Left front!" The men whipped around and received the new arrivals standing. Some of them, and among them their leader, fell at the first hurried shots. The rest vanished as swiftly as they had come. Now the moment to attack in turn. With fixed bayonets and rousing hurrah, we stormed the wood. We threw a volley of bombs into the tangled undergrowth and in a moment were once more in undisturbed possession of our outposts without having encountered the pliant enemy. We assembled in the cornfield and looked at each other. Our faces had an after the night before look, and a lark that rose into the sky and began its trills was an added exasperation. We were in much the same mood as when, after a night of play, the cards are flung on to the table and the windows thrown open to let the cool morning air blow away the hanging cloud of cigar smoke. While we handed round the water bottles and lit cigars, we heard the enemy retreating along the sunken road and the cries of the wounded they carried with them. I decided to survey the field of battle. Strange sounds and cries of pain came from the meadow where we had routed the enemy with our rifle fire. We found a number of dead in the long grass and 3 wounded who begged for mercy. They were convinced we would massacre them. When I asked, "Quelle nation?" one of them answered, "Pauvre Rajput." They were Indians who had come far over the sea to run their heads against the Hanover Fusiliers in this godforsaken corner of the earth. Their fine bodies were in an evil plight. At that short range, the infantry fire has an almost explosive effect. Many had been hit for the second time when they had fallen, so that the track of the bullet passed along the whole length of their bodies. Not one had been hit less than twice. We took the wounded up and carried them to our trench. They cried out as if they were being stuck with spears, till the men had to stop their mouths and threaten them with their fists, and at this they seemed to be comforted in their anguish. One of them died while he was being carried in. He was taken on all the same, as there was a price on the head of every prisoner, dead or alive. The 2 others strove to win our indulgency by shouting out all the time, "Anglais pas bon." Why these people spoke French, I have never quite made out. The company had heard the sounds of fighting and had had a heavy barrage put down on them. They welcomed us back to the trench in jubilation and with astonishment at our booty. I retired to our cabin with Kios and a half a dozen more, whom he quickly enrolled and was entertained in honor of the occasion with poached eggs. Our achievement received the notice it deserved and was mentioned in divisional orders with praise. With 20 men, we had beaten back a detachment many times our number, though they had taken us in the rear and though our orders were to withdraw if attacked in force. Such successes can, of course, only be won by troops whose discipline and morale are of the first order. Of myself, I could say with satisfaction that my command of the situation and my personal influence with my men had prepared a severe disappointment and an early grave for the officer who led the attack. We too had matched our wits in the same way as is customary in field exercises and training, except that we had not used dummy cartridges. If these lines are read by anyone belonging to the 1st Haryana Lancers, I wish to express to him in this place my respect for a body of men who could claim as their commander such a one as he whom I had the honor to fight. What does Nietzsche say of fighting men? You must have as enemies only those whom you hate, but not those whom you despise. You must be proud of your enemy, and then the enemy's success is your success also. The next evening I had orders again to occupy the outpost. It was impossible to occupy it by day, as it was in full view of the enemy. Kios and I, with 50 men, took each a side of the wood and met at the steep bank. There was nothing to be seen or heard of the enemy, except that there was a shout and a very light and a shot from the sunken road which Sergeant Major Hackman and I had reconnoitered. We marked this unwary individual down for our next expedition. At this spot, where we had beaten off the flank attack the night before, were lying 3 dead. 2 of them were Indians, and one a white officer with 2 gold stars on his shoulder straps, a lieutenant, therefore. He had been shot in the eye. The bullet went out through the opposite temple and had smashed the rim of his steel helmet, which is now among my collection of sinister trophies. His right hand still grasped the club, stained with his own blood, his left a large Colt 6-shooter. There were only 2 live cartridges left in the magazine. The men plundered the fallen. I've always hated the sight. All the same, I did not interfere. What they took was otherwise doomed to waste anyway, and aesthetic or moral considerations seemed to me to be out of place in this dark meadow ground over which all the callous relentlessness of war still brooded. During the following days, several more dead bodies were found in the undergrowth of the wood. This showed how heavy the enemy's losses had been and made the outpost a rather unpleasant place to be in. As I was working my way alone through a thicket, I heard a peculiar hissing and murmuring sound. I went nearer and came upon 2 corpses in which the heat had awakened a ghastly life. On the 18th June, the outpost was again attacked. This time the affair did not go off so well. The men broke and could not be rallied again. One, an NCO Erdelt, jumped straight off the bank in confusion. He rolled down and landed at the bottom among a party of Indians in ambush. He threw bombs but was soon caught by the throat by an Indian officer and scourged in the face with a wire whip. His watch was taken from him and he was pushed and thumped and marched off by his captors. However, he managed to escape when the Indians threw themselves down on account of our machine gun fire. After long wanderings behind the enemy's front, he regained our lines with thick wheals across his face. On the evening of the 18th June, I went on patrol with little Schulz, 10 men and a light machine gun. We set out from the outpost, now becoming by degrees somewhat oppressive, with the aim of paying the post that had lately made itself so obvious in the sunken road the honor of a visit. Schulz went with his party to the right of the sunken road, I to the left, with the understanding that if either party were fired on, the other should run to its help. We worked our way forward on hands and knees through grass and thickets of broom, pausing now and then to listen. Suddenly came the sharp rattle of a rifle bolt. We sank into the ground. Every old hand knows the series of feelings that occupied the next seconds. For the moment one has lost their initiative and must wait and see what the enemy does next. A shot broke the oppressive stillness. I lay behind a broom bush and waited. On my right, someone threw bombs into the sunken road. At once, a whole line of fire flashed out in front of us. The sickening sharpness of the report showed that the fire came from only a few yards ahead of us, and seeing that we had stumbled into too hot a corner, I gave the word to run for it. We all sprang up and sprinted for all we were worth, while rifle fire was opened on us from our left as well. I gave up all hope of a safe return when I heard this unholy clattered. Unconsciously, I was in constant expectation of being hit. Death was out hunting. Somewhere near us a detachment advanced to the attack with a small hurrah. Little Schulz confessed to me afterwards that he imagined a lean Indian behind him wielding a knife and already clutching him tight by the neck. I tumbled once and brought down the NCO Thailand Gerdas over on top of me. I lost my steel helmet, revolver and bombs. Anything to get on. At last we reached the protecting bank and tore down on it. Lieutenant Schulz reached it at the same time with his men. He announced, quite out of breath, that anyway he had paid out the cheeky post with bombs. Just after 2 men came in, carrying Fusilier F, who was wounded in both legs. All the rest were unharmed. The worst misfortune was that the man who had carried the machine gun, a recruit, had fallen over the wounded men and left the thing behind. While we were holding a brief council of war and planning a second expedition, the artillery began firing. I was reminded very precisely of the night of the 12th, for this time, too, there was a hopeless stampede. I found myself alone on the bank with the wounded man who, dragging himself forward by both his hands, implored me piteously not to leave him alone. "Don't leave me, sir, please." I had to, little as I liked it, in order to take my part in putting the outpost in fighting trim. I got the men together in a row of shallow firing positions on the edge of the wood, but I confess I was thankful when the day dawned without further incident. On such occasions I was always surprised and touched by the trusting reliance of the men on the ability of the officer to cope with the situation. "Where shall we go, sir?" "Help, sir, I'm wounded." "Where's the officer?" To be in command at such moments and to have a clear head is its own supreme reward, just as cowardice is its own punishment. I have always pitied the coward, in whom battle arouses a series of hellish tortures, while the spirit of the brave man merely rises the higher to meet a chain of exciting experiences. The next night found us at the same spot. Our object was to recover our machine gun. However, a succession of suspicious noises as we crept on warned us that once more there must be a strong detachment on the watch for us. It was decided, therefore, in accordance with a point of honor which, like many others in the war, made us inwardly curse, to recover the lost weapon by force. At 12 midnight, after 3 minutes artillery preparation, we were to attack the enemy posts and look for the gun. I put the best face I could on the sorry business, and in the afternoon I shot some ranging shots with some of the batteries. At 11 at night, I was once more with Schulz, my companion in misfortune, on the uncanny bit of ground where I had already passed so many exciting moments. The smell of corruption was scarcely endurable in the sultry air. We sprinkled the bodies with quicklime that we had brought with us in sacks. The covering of white shone out like grave clothes in the darkness. The Enterprise opened with our own machine gun fire whistling between our legs and pattering against the bank. On this account, Schulz and I had a violent altercation, for he himself had given the machine gunners their range. We were reconciled, however, when Schulz discovered me behind a bush in close confabulation with a bottle of Burgundy that I had brought with me to invigorate me for the precarious adventure and to calm my nerves, which had been on the stretch for 9 days past. The first shell came along to the minute and landed 50 meters behind us. Before we could express our surprise at this extraordinary shooting, a second was planted close behind us on the bank and showered us with earth. It was not for me even to emit a curse, for I myself had given the range for the guns. After this cheerful opening, we advanced more as a matter of honor than with any great hopes of success. Luckily, the enemy posts had apparently retired. Otherwise, we might have had a very unpleasant reception. Unfortunately, we did not find the machine gun, nor did we search for it very long. On the way back, Schulz and I once more told each other what we really thought. I about the way he had directed his machine gun fire, and he about the shooting of the guns. I had tested the range so accurately that the affair seemed incomprehensible. Later, I learned that guns always shoot short at night, and that I ought to have added a few hundred meters when I gave the range. Then we sat down to the most important part of the business, the report. We did so well that everyone was delighted. The skirmishing came to an end the next day, for we were relieved by another division. We went back to Montbrehan for a time and marched from there to Cambrai, where we spent nearly the whole of July. The outpost was finally lost on the night following our relief. And once again our man is extremely lucky. First, he sleeps through an intense shelling, later fights off 70 English soldiers, and finally nearly dies multiple times while defending an outpost. Once even because the ranges, the fire support units, were set incorrectly. He's truly kissed by luck, as we say. However, I cannot get over the fact that he left a wounded man behind, yet returned to look for a lost machine gun. This is incomprehensible to me, especially for someone who put so much emphasis on honor. When I went through basic, it was drilled into us even back then to never leave anyone behind. Never, ever. I have some additional literature and sources about this book, but none of them ever take up this story. Strange, but maybe that's just me. He also mentions the battle with the Indian troops. He himself claims them to have been the 1st Regiment of the Haryana Lancers, but in fact it was the 7th. Doesn't matter for the story, but this is Trench Diaries and we try to keep things accurate here. Anyway, the helmet he took as a souvenir he indeed kept for as long as he lived in his house, and for some time you could visit his writing room as a museum. The helmet, along with one of his own, was still there. Today they are in a museum and not accessible to the public. Anyway, Cambrai is coming up, and there he will be pushed even more. I will see you then. Cheers.